We'll just start off with introductions. Good evening, everyone, and it gives us great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth talk in the series called Science and Society. The idea behind organizing this series came about last month when Mahavir Narwal passed away of COVID on the 8th of May. He was a scientist based in Rohtak in Haryana and was also an active part of the people science movements. He was committed to social justice and in many ways embodied the image of the scientist whose vision stretched beyond the lab into a concern for society, for politics, and for a hopeful future for humankind. So it is to him that this series is dedicated. And the series brings together a group of eminent scholars who share a progressive view and vision of the relation of science to society. It is a vision which sees the role for a scientific and rationalist temper in challenging socially oppressive hierarchies. It's a vision which sees the importance of an ethical role of science and the ethical engagement of the scientific community. And finally, it envisions science for the many and not just for the few. So with that, I'll hand over to Prathamesh, who will introduce today's speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Lena, for the introduction to the series. And I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Gurukul here. And Professor Gurukul is a historian and an academic of repute. He has held faculty positions at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, at Mahatma Gandhi University at Kottayam, and at the Institute of Science, where he was a Sundararajan visiting professor. And he was also the former vice chancellor of uh, Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam, and has been a scholar on, especially in what's history of early Kerala. And apart from, of course, his own work as an academic and a scholar, I've had the fortune of knowing him as a teacher and as an intellectual who often engaged with the student community. And so he taught us a course when I was in the Institute of Science on the social production of knowledge, and that was one of the most or rather on production of knowledge in social and natural and social sciences, and especially in social theories of production of knowledge. And that was the most intellectually stimulating courses I did during my graduate studies, which kind of opened a whole new dimensions and many interesting questions and many ways of looking at different questions. And also, Professor Gurukul, we also had many informal discussions and definitely gave a very interesting talk back during my day on depoliticizing dimension of science that I remember. Yeah. So thanks, Professor Gurukul, for actually agreeing to speak to us, and I'm very glad that he kind of agreed to be part of this series. And so currently he's the vice chairman of the Kerala Council for Higher Education. And yeah, thanks for taking your time out for just the meeting. Thanks a lot. So what do you, Professor Gurukul, now?
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Prathamesh and colleagues and others, good evening, all of you. Science and economy is the topic. And I need hardly have to define science and economy to an audience like this. But let me tell you what I really mean by the two terms in the context. Science, as you know, is rational knowledge that explains with proof based on experimentation. Economy means production, consumption, and exchange. It has multiple levels and processes, temporally speaking. We identify them as various forms or sometimes systems. There is a dominant economic form that subsumes other forms or levels. As you all know, today's globally dominant economy is called capitalism. It is defined as capital intensive, technology intensive, uh, energy intensive, natural resources intensive, profit maximizing industrial production for global consumption and global exchange. Now, there is a well-known theme, which is economics of science, which deals with the importance of science as a driver of technology and technology as a driver of productivity. That's not what I would like to discuss. Now, my focus is on the political economy of science. Political economy, as you know, deals with the macro power relations of production, consumption, and exchange. It deals with the status of science in the micro power relations of capitalist economy. Karl Marx is still the unsurpassed authority of the theory of capitalism. He viewed economic production in terms of means, relations, and forces. Accordingly, Marx viewed science as the knowledge base of the capitalist economy's forces of production, certainly with technology playing a crucial role in it. Historically, the rational knowledge, I use rational knowledge for the term science because for some time I will be referring to the period prior to 19th century. And at that time, the term used was either rational knowledge or natural philosophy for science, or that branch of knowledge acquired the term science only in the 19th century. Therefore, I talk about knowledge of the rational kind using natural philosophy or the expression rationalism. Technology advanced under the pressure of demand for products exceeding the supply of labor. Profit-driven entrepreneurs invested their mercantile wealth, that is money, in industrial crafts production and mines. Money, thus acquiring the power of reinvestment, became capital by commanding labor. As Marx said, unencumbered labor. Because during those days, labor was not independent. Labor was part of the agrarian system, feudalism, and although as serfs and villains, they had small plots of land, but they were deprived of time to cultivate. And in actual practice, therefore, they were bonded laborers, and often their power to labor was owned and controlled by the landlords. So in that sense, when we talk about labor during the medieval and late medieval times, we have to call them as encumbered laborers. But Marx defined the process, he interpreted the process of the conversion of money into capital as the process of money encountering the unencumbered labor of the workers thrown out from the declining feudal order. That is the context I am referring to here, that money becoming capital through industries of crafts production and then mines, where these unencumbered laborers were, that is, laborers thrown out from the villages, were deployed. And then money paid to them as wages came back in the form of products with surplus value, with a lot of exchange value, often as the entrepreneurs decided. And therefore, money with enormous investment power became capital. This pressure of investment of money in factories and mines accounted for the Industrial Revolution. Rising towns and its aristocracy enhanced demand for goods and services, but lacking enough supply of labor caused the subjection of the workforce into proletarians. Although rational thinking and technology flourished independently as curiosity-driven fields of knowledge and practice, by and large, they were under the command of the capitalist economy. I cannot go into the timeline of discoveries and inventions here, but the closer you draw towards the context of these discoveries and inventions, the clearer you are about the command of the economy. It is true that many a discovery or invention is accidental, but necessarily has always been there as the pressure. But if you ask whose necessity, you see the command of the economy there. But generally, we just make a generalization saying that necessity is the mother of invention. But seldom we ask whose necessity are we talking about. So it's not possible for me to go into all these details because that aspect comes here only as the background, or without touching that, I wouldn't be able to discuss the present situation or the present context of the relationship between science and economy. Now, universities and research institutions were the major centers engaged in the production of rational knowledge and technology. Indeed, these fields were flourishing on their own as well as under the patronage of the state, often without any economic motives. Such altruism apart, you see the industrialist role in the promotion of research leading to most discoveries and inventions. Life-taking plagues and wars required medicines, but effective medicines began to be available with the establishment of pharmaceutical industries that began in the second half of the 19th century. Responding to the demand for medicines during the plague, European wars, and the American Civil War, medical inventions began in the pharmaceutical companies. The first notable company was Bisham in Germany, which began production of patented medicines from 1847 onwards, but by 1859, it became a major industry exclusively dedicated for the manufacture of medicines. Other similar industries sprang up. Rational knowledge, known as natural philosophy, began to be known as science during the late or second half of the 19th century. Spanish flu and the First World War proliferated this industry. During and after the World War II, governments became increasingly interested in scientific progress. Science and technology acquired great importance in the context of war. World War II has often been called the physicists' war for the role that those scientists played in the development of new weapons and tools, notably the proximity radar and the atomic bomb. It was called Manhattan Project, as most of you know. The bulk of these activities took place as a new form of research facility. The government-sponsored facility or government-sponsored research. They were having government-sponsored laboratories in certain select universities. In this case, the University of California and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So thousands of technicians and scientists were employed, all with the specific projects as part of the belligerency of the nation. The two key figures in the projects were Vannevar Bush and James B. Conant. Vannevar Bush was an engineer, an American engineer and science administrator known for his work on analog computing and the idea of MEMX, an adjustable microfilm reader. He was the primary organizer of the Manhattan Project and an influential bureaucrat with a political role in the development of the atomic bomb. James B. Conant was the president of Harvard University. After the success of the Manhattan Project, governments became the chief patron of science. And the character of the scientific establishment underwent several key changes. Now, capitalist economy took a lot of interest in the promotion of research in the basic science, although state was always interested in the protection and defense of the state power. But the industrial capitalism somehow thought of investing money in the field of basic sciences. It accounted for the growth of physics, chemistry, and biology. In the past, technology owed advances to scientific discoveries. That was the reason why technology is often considered as the follower of science. But very soon, as you know, technology became an autonomous field, and science was only a language for technology's trial and error researches. Anyway, in the past, it was not like that. Technology advanced using scientific discoveries. For example, the quantum revolution and the structural molecular biology advanced through pure science rather than technology. Technology of the transistor, laser, and the integrated chip was its result, or they all came directly from scientific theories. Many pharmaceuticals, materials, molecular diagnostics, vaccines are contributions over a century-long chemistry and biology. I mean, pure theoretical studies in chemistry and biology. The latest phase of capitalism is called techno-capitalism because it heavily depends on science and technology. If I think about one of the best studies on the theme, that's on the process of the arrival of the new version of capitalism, or the latest phase of capitalism. Andrew Feinberg's critical theory of technology comes to my mind. Andrew Feinberg is a well-known political economist, and his critical theory of technology was published by Oxford University in 1991. He tried to explain the changes taking place in capitalism, so reviewing the various phases of depressions or decline encountered by capitalism in the context of accumulation. But in one way or other, capitalism made a comeback. And every time, capitalism came back with some basic changes about the sources that it would depend upon for facilitating capitalist accumulation. But in the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, and also towards the close of the 90s, this political economist, Andrew Feinberg, was able to identify certain characteristics. And he found capitalism shifting significantly from using science and technology for manufacturing products, and then depending upon what is called commodity fetishism for accumulating profit. It was shifting from the use of science and technology to science and technology itself. He was trying to show that there was a close move towards how science itself can be commoditized, or how technology itself can be commoditized. Or this is rather, in Marxian terms, a very strange phenomenon, that's conversion of forces of production into commodity itself. In this case, it was even conversion of commodity into capital directly. So this phenomenon was noted by Feinberg, but he never named it after science and technology. Now he noticed that this new version of capitalism was engaging in the commoditization of technology and science as the main source of capital accumulation. Engaged in the production, consumption, and exchange of marketable new knowledge, it was actually doing this business of treating knowledge as an object of exchange, and then thinking about developing various aspects of knowledge that also could be transacted as commodities, aspects like intellectual property and patents. In description, he was very close to the name techno-capitalism, but the actual coinage happened only later. He discussed at length how knowledge was becoming both commodity and capital in the process of transactions. Trading in the innovative knowledge and creativity, which is well known today as intangible assets. The new version of capitalism, which the later writers like Suarez Villa, Michael Perelman, and others named as techno-capitalism, and then as part of disseminating the whole new ideas as rhetoric, a very commonsensical expression came into vogue, that is knowledge economy. Drucker, a writer, dealt with knowledge economy by borrowing the concepts of neoclassical economics. He was not able to understand what Andrew Feinberg and Luis Horace Villa and Michael Perelman were trying to put across. Anyway, this new version of capitalism came up with a new form of organization as well, which is again well known to us, this corporate form of organization. Therefore, Michael Perelman was first to refer to this new capitalism as corporate techno-capitalism. It was also referred to as corporate techno-military imperialism, and it was different from the existing capitalism in various ways. Michael Perelman was exasperated by the way it was using the young, innovative minds for the protection of intellectual property and patents, but by alienating them from the authorship. Michael Perelman's very well-known book, the title itself is very interesting, or the title tells you what the contents would be. Steal This Idea, Intellectual Property Rights and the Corporate Confiscation of Creativity. That's the title. Steal This Idea. The book is quite relevant here because I'm discussing how science and technology were depended upon for the production of marketable knowledge and The process involved alienation of scientists from the process of production of knowledge. And also they commanded what kind of knowledge should be produced, because these corporates decide what would be marketable and what would not be. Perelman's work provides a political economy perspective and shows how corporations have erected a system of intellectual property rights to confiscate creativity. And certainly, I need hardly tell you how profound its impact would be on the economy, particularly science and technology, but also on society and culture. It strikes at the very fundamental rights of an individual and ruins the micro foundation of democracy. This corporate system, as I mentioned earlier, the techno-military imperialism is systematically uprooting democracy. Uprooting democracy through a variety of sophisticated ways, including high wage to the select few. Now, we see our friends, as far as I am concerned, people of my son's age, becoming highly paid experts. And their salary is very, very attractive, but completely enslaved. They don't have a boss right in front of them, but there is techno-military imperialism operating through electronic sophistication. They are responsible to the establishment for 24 hours, and the laptop would do the surveillance. Or these young girls and boys could be called upon to attend to any problem, anytime, anywhere. So that is the peculiar situation, but they are paid well. And not only that, their creativity is confiscated by the establishment, because the patent and intellectual property right would go to the company or the corporate establishment. And naturally, one of the outcomes of the corporate appropriation of creativity and of the rapid rise of intellectual property theft and infringements is an excessive amount of international litigations. Now, Luis Suarez Villa, who is another social theorist and political economist, and he's a policy scientist. He published his first book in 2009, Techno-Capitalism, A Critical Perspective on Technological Innovation and Corporatism. He argues that it's a new version of capitalism that generates new forms of corporate organization designed to exploit intangibles such as creativity and a new knowledge of scientists and technologies. In his another book, Globalization and Techno-Capitalism, the Political Economy of Corporate Power and Technological Domination, published in 2012 by Temple University Press, discusses the emergence and growth of techno-capitalist corporations. Corporate houses have globally established powerful techno-military complexes of electronic sophistication and juridical devices for confiscating the intangible assets. That's what they themselves call intellectual property or patents and so on. They constitute what is called intellectual assets and also intangible assets. And the corporate houses gain monopolistic control over not only the intangible assets, but also over the scientists themselves during the period of their operation. So this enslavement under a very, very sophisticated kind of setup. Actually, they don't get time to sleep, and there isn't much of difference from the robots as far as they are concerned. If they get time, they sleep. They don't understand what they eat, where. They don't see society in its real sense. In big hotels, they stay in various conference halls and so on. They exchange ideas, but they seldom realize that a supercomputer is incessantly enslaving them and confiscating their creativity. Each one of them perhaps is enjoying the task of finishing what is assigned to. That may be a small module. In the high-powered computer, they would do a small module without knowing what would be the use of that and where it would be used. So like that, thousands of young scientists and technologists, and sometimes young people who do not know any of science, but they know only software technology. So such people are employed and they are asked to do research, mainly with the help of high-powered computer and sometimes with wearable headsets and other instruments with which they would experience mixed reality or virtual reality, whatever. And in that kind of setting, they would do their experiments. They would do their experiments only in virtual laboratories. Now that kind of life, Suarez Villa was talking empathetically about them, but with a lot of political criticism against the process of knowledge production that the corporate houses are practicing. As I said earlier, Michael Perelman's work, which provides the political economy perspective, has certainly made clear the unbearable exploitative dimension of the relationship between the corporate houses and then the young scientists and technologists employed in their huge research establishments. Corporate scientists are giving birth to several science tech hybrid domains of research, like genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and high performance computation technology as their main areas of interest, where techno-capitalists are making heavy investments. Technology is driving science today. It is compelling scientists to transform their discoveries into inventions. If a scientist is able to discover a new molecule, any high impact factor journal is interested in knowing the application of that. The new molecule, the new molecular pure science is nobody's interest in the capitalist sector, unlike the industrial capitalism. So they would be interested in knowing the application. Generally, all the high impact factor journals are being published by the corporates themselves. So when a scientist, I mean a theoretical scientist, discovering the possibility of a molecule, new molecule, and then sending a paper about it to the journal, the editor would write back asking for some time. First, acceptance would be communicated, but then would ask some time. And the time is for taking consultation of application from the competent experts. So once Roger Singh, who got Nobel, who passed away, he had visited Mahatma Gandhi University when I was heading the institution. So Roger Singh got Nobel Prize for discovering the biochemistry of the seashells becoming fluorescent. And he sent his paper and he told me the story about it. He sent his paper about the discovery, that is the biochemical truth about the jellyfish becoming fluorescent. The journal sent a reply saying that the journal should be permitted to seek consultation. Roger Singh wrote back saying, I am an engineer myself. I am a biotechnologist. You don't have to consult. I don't permit you to consult. I have already circulated this paper among my peers. All people who are doing serious work in the field know about my study, but still I thought of getting it published because it would have a wider reach. You return the paper. I don't want you to publish it. Then, the assiduously persuading response was, Dr. Singh, why don't you then develop yourself the application of that? And Roger Singh did. And Roger Singh was paid an unimaginable remuneration for that. Yes, that that invention is yet to reach us. If I remember correctly, he was saying something about the same biochemistry applied would enable malignant cells illuminated in the body. So that would be helpful for detecting the formation of malignant cells in the body. Anyway, what I'm saying is the corporate houses are so rigorously engaged in the production of new knowledge for accumulation of intellectual property and patents. We cannot have a relationship of confrontation if we are interested in doing research in science, doing research in technology. What I mean to say is science and technology is a hybrid domain for them. And as they have globally established huge research establishments employing thousands of youngsters, they decide what should be the domain developed, what should be the problem investigated into, and they have very clear idea. They have a very clear map for the next 50 years regarding what would be the demands like, what gadgets would be required. And one of the very fascinating areas of their interest is brain-computer interface. There's direct communication with the biochemical process with the help of algorithmic devices. Or is it possible to develop nanotech sensors and transmitters to communicate with the neurons directly and so on? So one doesn't know what would be the result, but they are doing serious research in functional genomics based on automated methods of microarray technology for analyzing gene expressions, and structural genomics based on X-ray crystallography and robotic crystallization procedures for determining gene structure, high-field NMR spectroscopy for determining protein structures, DNA barcoding for species identification, other high-performance computing methods, layer-by-layer assembly of nanofilms, so on and so forth. It is techno-capitalism that has changed the research culture completely. Today, pure science research is driven by sophisticated technology. Genetics best exemplifies the trend. Science tech research is the most crucial field of corporate interest, and therefore, they don't depend upon universities and public funded research institutions. Advanced software and molecular processors in computing and communications using various sophisticated devices are part of their technology, and that kind of technology itself is giving birth to a large number of commodities, and they govern huge research projects across the world. Now, any major research project would involve sometimes allocation of 80% of the total outlay for the purchase of the sophisticated instruments. Sometimes these instruments wouldn't have any role in the project, but institutions are constrained to buy them. And many universities today, with the scientists doing major research projects, have dumped very expensive instruments. Even by way of AMC, university would be paying through nose. Most universities wouldn't be able to pay AMC for these sophisticated instruments of no use. And they are getting accumulated in various institutions. It's part of the huge corporate trade. And now, fields such as nanotech sensors and transmitters, as I mentioned earlier, bioengineered processors, synthetic bioengineering, bioinformatics, biomimetics, robotics, cloud computing, graphene engineering, holographic interfaces, and then brain-computer interfaces, and biopharmacology are growing fields of innovations for the imminent future. Now, when COVID-19 set in, one of my students sent me a message asking what would be the fate of capitalism. Then I said capitalism wouldn't have any problem at all, because capitalism had already mutated itself for being the best player in the days of pandemic. So nowhere in the history you find a vaccine that the entire globe required. So a pharmaceutical industry discovering vaccine in unbelievable speed, and then, of course, circulating across the countries. Certainly, there is huge pressure of people on the pricing of it. Therefore, unlike the vaccines produced earlier, COVID vaccines are not able to fix huge price. but still there is margin, but compared to the price of other vaccines, it's nothing. But anyway, what this new economy is doing in the domain of science and technology is literally preventing the growth of science and technology in its fundamental sense. Now, compelling scientists to turn their theoretical output into knowledge with applicability. So they are constrained to transform their theoretical knowledge into knowledge of application. And knowing very well that pure science or basic science research wouldn't be yielding knowledge with a lot of application and knowledge which would generate a lot of exchange value. So techno-capitalists generally don't show any interest in basic science research because of its unprofitability. Basic science research is inherently uncertain also, and it attempts to understand nature at the fundamental level. It tries and explains natural processes, natural phenomena, still very complex. Scientists require to work on hypotheses, many of which will inevitably incorrect. Since it is difficult to establish intellectual property and patents over fundamental knowledge, there is no scope of big returns out of such research enterprises. Hence, no change of big capitalist investments. I'm sorry. No change in the pattern of capitalist investments in the field for the imminent future, at least. We do not know what will happen in future, but so long as techno-capitalism reigns supreme, there is no chance of any fundamental change in the domain of research. It will go on alienating scientists from the knowledge they produce. What Marx told about commodity fetishism in the context of market exploiting the social products by calling it commodities, as if commodity is something sui generis in the market. So same commodity fetishism, which alienated the social labor from the products. Here you find intellectual products getting alienated from scientists and technologies. This leads to extortionate prices, and scientists are mere tools in its hands. So scientists are rather helpless. And some of the young scientists realize that what they generated by way of their own publication, sometimes as first authors, really do not belong to them. Now, some scientists realize only when they compile their leading studies, which earned them high H index, but they realized that these articles belonged to the corporate publications. Now, this confiscation is having different dimensions. Anyway, I do not want to elaborate further. The overall situation today is, on the one side, putting completely production of knowledge under the control of the economy, a new kind of economy, the latest version of capitalism, which the whole world is recognizing as knowledge economy, and every nation is adopting policies for transforming the people into knowledge society without knowing what knowledge society really means. So of course it has that superficial side of making people equipped in securing some jobs in knowledge economy. Because without knowledge in digital technology, without experience in working under ICT environment, people may not be able to, educated people may not be able to win any job. So nations are taking special care in planning higher education accordingly and asking students to go ahead as self-directed learners. And they have the digital portfolios helping them to acquire knowledge on their own without a teacher's help. And teachers are getting converted into mentors and facilitators. Teachers are expected to be facilitators in the process of the free acquisition of knowledge by learners. Now, ideally, that has been the tradition in the past, because a higher learner is driven by her own curiosity. And scholars as teachers were expected, or scholars as teachers in the past were helping them acquire knowledge as they would prefer. But for some period, teaching became top heavy and a dictatorial process from top to bottom. And teacher was the monopolistic knowledge giver. And that kind of situation rather invited the easy access of techno-capitalism to the field of higher education. But anyway, now the culture of free higher education by, free in a different sense, uninfluenced or absolutely self-directed kind of learning without any rigidity, without any institutional imposition. Learners are set free to acquire the kind of knowledge that they want. Anyway, corporate interest is to get creative minds wherever they are available. So corporates are planning higher education in such a way that as many students as possible would be trained in the environment of electronic sophistication. They would be able to use tools, apps, and devices within the digital portfolios so that they could be easily used by paying lesser salary. If there are many, certainly salary would come down. And that kind of an atmosphere is being planned by the corporate houses. But it's not mere converting youth into robots or converting scientists into robots. Not merely depriving them of their academic freedom to pursue research in areas of interest, areas of their curiosity. But it is a total but silent ravaging of the human population, human culture, and also nature through a reckless exploitation of natural resources. It is causing a series of major social, economic, and political consequences in the Afro-Asian countries in general and India in particular, because it enables corporatism to be ever more intrusive and rapacious through its militant control over technology and innovation. It's also uprooting the emerging scientific temper, if it is taking place in any place whatsoever. In India, it was growing in some places, I know, but even in such places, scientism is at work as a mystifying source, and corporate research is very much interested in pushing people into false consciousness. And unfortunately, India is that kind of a nation now. I'm really afraid of that kind of situation where cow research is going on and all youngsters in the country were given the choice to write an examination in cow science. I don't know what kind of science it is, but I have no quarrel about doing research in cow urine, but not with the prejudice that cow urine is something sacred and it is different from the urine of any other animal and so on. But, that kind of attitude will curb scientific curiosity among scientists and will curb scientific temper in society. And this accentuates the process of destruction of micro level democratization process or grassroots democratic processes. It is systematically impairing all democratic bodies and structures by transforming the state completely into crony capitalist. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Gurukul, for the talk. And so I would just like to know if there are first any questions, because I have a couple of questions of my own. And thanks a lot for the again for the talk. So yeah, so any questions that anybody would want to have? Would want to ask. Yeah. So anyone who has any questions, so please feel free to unmute your mic and questions. So please.
I think I was audible throughout. There was no break or anything.
Prathamesh, your audio is very faint.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, 1 second. Okay, let me try and see. Okay. Is it better now? Okay, cool. So yes, any questions anyone has? I think I can see hands from Zen. So would you want to ask? Sorry, yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your talk. It was really very fascinating. I had two connected questions. Very broad questions. So the first question was, what can we do about this, about the impact of techno-capitalism upon scientific research and upon, as you mentioned through your talk, on the scientific community as a whole? And the second question, which is related, is what should be, ideally, the relationship of the scientific community to the state? Because I think you gave I was very struck by the example that you gave towards the beginning of your talk of the Manhattan Project, which is a completely state-funded an extremely destructive enterprise. So, what should be, I guess they're interconnected. What should be the relationship of the scientific community to the state?
Yeah. No, I'm transported to the thinking of Antonio Gramsci, who talked about organic intellectuals. I feel that it is time for scientists en bloc to get transformed into organic intellectuals. It is time for scientists and technologists to assume war of position, as Gramsci said. Gramsci talked about intellectuals or academics in two ways. One, the traditional intellectuals and the other organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals are supposed to be committed to social processes and relations, committed to social justice, and they were expected to make a systematic cultural transformation in society for understanding the processes at work completely against them, alienating them. So I'm really reminded of that kind of a situation, but unfortunately Gramsci had no chance to organize people, or so he ended in the jail and he left his prison notes. But interestingly, we are in that kind of a setup where scientists have to focus more and more on basic sciences and address the issues of the ordinary people. Now you have at least something like 37% of the areas still not having satisfied the drinking water problem. Or you have various epidemics of local nature, and people have all kinds of difficulties. Farmers and then ordinary workers and so on and so forth. They are all getting completely alienated from their livelihood practices. All these are going on. But you have a totally unconcerned kind of system in which the science tech hybrid areas are generating products for whose satisfaction. Even this satisfaction is something planted. Each mind is being prepared as a factory of demands. Unwanted wants are being generated in the minds of people, and they are used as the basis for marketing various objects, goods.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Any further questions there? I think Jam had a question, if I'm not wrong. So because I remember your camera.
No. Thank you. Yeah, not so much question, but yeah, I mean, there are many strands of thought in what Professor Gurkar was mentioning. I was thinking more about especially the current wave of algorithms running our lives. The surveillance capitalism that we see, and a kind of a black box society that we are building with the use of technology is also transforming enormously in the 21st century, especially with occupying the minds of people. I think that transformation is something that, it is not only products that you use in the traditional sense of, the unwanted products that you use, like maybe, I don't know, Coca-Cola or whatever, and, taste and satisfaction, as Professor Gurkar was mentioning, but also the way we think, the way, an extension of our minds, your memory today is in the cloud, right? It is, you lose your phone. I don't know what all you're going to lose when you lose your phone, right? So the very extensions of ourselves, the technology encroaching into our mental space, our thinking space, our articulation space, our communication space. So these are things I think we need to take very, very seriously indeed. And this corporate techno hold on our society has to be approached very, very critically. So I think even, what shall I say, becoming aware of these, critiquing these, and that becoming part of our education and our thought has to be something very important on the agenda. So I'm just adding to
Sure.
that dimension to what
very important. Yeah, I was actually referring to the techno-military imperialism. Actually, in our academic language, sometimes various expressions fragment the overall structure of thinking. For example, people refer to surveillance capitalism. See, it in fact fragment the overall perception. There isn't anything called surveillance capitalism. Surveillance is only an external political manifestation of techno-capitalism, and techno-capitalism being global and a system which is no more interested in catering to the bourgeois democracy. It doesn't need a democratic system. So it is completely against a democratic process. So there is a very strong but leavening influence of imperialism. It is transnational imperialism. The nations are all mostly techno-capitalist, maybe one or two like China, but China is a capitalist, a state capitalist setup. And therefore, a state like that could be used very effectively by the corporates. And other states are weak states, and they are helpful in sustaining false consciousness and superstitions in society. And that would dismember people, and there would be no threat from such places against techno-capitalism. So techno-capitalism is so powerful that it has at its disposal the latest technology and science.
Hi, Professor Gurukul. I think there's a question from Aishwarya. So would you like to ask it yourself, Aishwarya? So, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so Aishwarya says, question is, thank you so much for the talk, Professor. I had a question. You talked about how the monopolistic hold on knowledge by the teachers in between, in some ways, invited techno-capitalism. Can you please elaborate on that process?
No, I didn't get it. Monopoly.
So I think the point of her question was she says that the monopolistic hold on knowledge by teachers invited techno-capitalism.
Okay.
So how was that process? Was something that
I was incidentally referring to the traditional system of education with all problems relating to social discrimination based on caste and gender and so on. But in the past orthodox kind of setup, a minority that really had interest, although they belonged to the upper caste, they alone were able to learn, but that learning was really curiosity-driven learning. And a teacher or the scholar teacher was only shaping and making their projects rather than imposing anything of his own on her or him. But what we find in the recent past is a decline of that kind of teaching learning. Teacher on one side as the monopolistic authority as the knowledge giver, and students on the other hand as the takers. There used to be not even dialogue for a lot of time in various institutions. It used to be a militaristic kind of disciplining within the officially commissioned space called a classroom. Students were not expected to ask questions. And there was absolutely no interaction because any utterance on the part of the student meant violation of the discipline. And that sort of a setup existed. So I was incidentally referring to that non-productive phase of higher education. And when that became part of massification of higher education by the private sector, now you find authoritarian institutions coming up. And these institutions disciplining students and these institutions maintaining torture cells and so on in the institutions and so on. So such an unbearable kind of decadence had happened. And now you find corporates talking about curiosity-driven learning and learners self-directed and completely free, and higher education is a personalized enterprise and so on. But there the interest is totally different. But this is the interesting thing, the combination of the unbearable and then the highly admired together.
Prathamesh, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Now, I think I also see a hand raised by Zen. So, do you have a question again? Do you have another question? Zen? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Professor, I just wanted to ask you if you could, given that there are young students here, I was wondering whether if you could expand a bit on what you were saying earlier about the fact that scientists should become organic intellectuals.
Yeah.
What would this mean? Because I guess, as you talked about so brilliantly in your talk, being in an academic institution and being and the kind of hold of techno-capitalism on a lot of these institutions changes very subtly how students see science. You talked about the eclipsing of science by technology and the drive for kind of practical results and so on. So what should a young student who wants to become a sort of an organic intellectual in that sense, a scientist and an organic intellectual, what should they be doing?
Yeah, they should ask first, what does science mean? And then they are unfortunately in a situation where they have to have a deconstructed reading of the word science. Because semantic is now closed off. The science communicates criticality and creativity as the opposite and reverse of the same coin. But the youngsters now getting initiated in the field of science are compelled to follow certain stereotypes. And even when they write a paper, it is peer reviewed. And when a paper is peer reviewed, the paper will certainly be passed when it sticks on to the generally accepted knowledge framework. A strikingly new idea or a totally different kind of framework upsetting the dominant one would never get published, because no established reviewer would be able to promote it. So there is a lot of thing to do with the regimenting kind of teaching, research, writing, and publication. So they should be given freedom to go to nature and then enjoy the processes there. I think I can recollect what Raghavendra Gadakar has been doing as an entomologist. His research students have been free to go around enjoying nature, wasps and bees and ants and so on. And research is to be least expensive. And they all come out with strikingly fresh knowledge. The young students have to wrench themselves away from the shackles put on them by the system. Perhaps the corporate style of free education or the digital technology driven higher education will give them freedom to reinvent the curiosity element in themselves, and also the criticality that gets transmitted from science. And then they see society, social problems, and automatically they become organic intellect. Otherwise, they will become very rigid kind of scientist, not much different from a robot.
Like, so I think Nena had a question. And, no, Rishi, did you also have a question? Okay,
You had a question, right?
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Rajani.
Okay. So my question is, I think one is the whole question of subversion, the possibilities of subversion. I mean, apart from one is of course the emergence of organic intellectuals, and the second question is like scientists within the established, and also as someone I think who've been associated with the Shastra Sahitya Parishad, with the Kerala KSSP. So what kind of role do you envision for the people science movements? So that was the one question that I had. Yeah. Uh, and then the second question is also with respect to, let's say, when we talk about capitalism or any kind of a new age capitalism within, I mean, or science in the era of capitalism. So, what kind of peculiarities do we perhaps see in the possibility of a post-colonial capitalist class? Because, let's say, for instance, the Indian capitalist class will not have the same kind of a scientific understanding of maturity of that you could expect in, let's say, the Europe or US, right? I mean, here, for instance, my personal observation is they get far more carried away with buzzwords than with any actual understanding of science. So, what kind of peculiarities do we kind of? Yeah. So, yeah. So,
Yeah, you're very right. The movements like Shastra Sahitya Parishad, also various countercultural movements would certainly help. But the problem is to organize that kind of a movement or to use the entrenched forums like Shastra Sahitya Parishad. It's very difficult because you have to address youngsters who are partly robotized through their various institutions. Training them in utterly uncongenial environments, even in the tropical area, they would be made to sit in non-AC classrooms with the tie and coat and all kinds of things. So these are all. I do not say that these were part of conspiracy or anything, but it so happens that various disciplining mechanisms systematically convert a vibrant youngster into a robot. That is there. And see, earlier on, we used to talk about depoliticizing youngsters, because at some stage, they might have imbibed values of politics. But now it is not like that. There is no question of politicizing. I mean, there is no question of politicizing them, and there is no chance of repoliticizing them. They haven't been politicized at all. And how to de-robotize them, how to politicize them, and then make them capable of re-articulating themselves among people. This is really a huge task because the system has become amazingly successful in transforming people into inactive objects. People not able to understand what politics means. So you think about a youngster having trained in a private, sophisticated school till higher secondary, and then in a private university, and then having studied computer software, and then campus recruited for a blue chip or a corporate company. Now, he is only a speaking robot, or he is a robot which may cry, or a robot will satisfy the function of biological reproduction. Apart from that, he doesn't know what May Day means. He doesn't know the history of labor development. He doesn't know the history of social affairs and structural processes. So a student not trained in social perception and appreciation in historical way, or thinking about his own condition or her own condition with critical self-reflexivity. It's very, very difficult. I have encountered this personally, addressing various meetings of +1, +2 students. I used to sympathize with them. It's very difficult. They don't understand. So they have already been molded like that. So only hope is in the rural public schools, you have free minds who cannot speak English, but with great difficulty, they communicate, and there is originality in their expression. And they are susceptible to politicization, and they would be susceptible to understand values and passions of democracy. They would be able to understand what we are saying, but the rich sections or upper castes in various areas in the country, like India, they are nurturing very old-fashioned kind of ideas. Some of them are after their identity crisis. They are thinking about their caste identity, and I'm really afraid of that kind of a situation. How do you work with them? It's very, very difficult. So I'm not optimistic about making people understand the political vibrance of democracy and realize the self-appointed imprisonment, self-imposed imprisonment of themselves. They have to liberate themselves from the clutches they are lost. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, thanks for the answer, Professor Gurukul. Any other questions? Or any of the students have any questions? I can see Prabjit here. So yeah, anyone? Okay. So, oh hi, Gautam. Yes. So you have a question? Yeah, hi.
I'm not sure this is a question, but I just wanted to put into discussion something based on what Professor Gurukul said, but I'm not sure whether he's interested in this line of thinking at all, which is when you mentioned, who's that invention as the parent mother. Necessity as the parent mother of invention, and then you asked whose necessity. And then I was thinking the sort of there is a less obvious answer, which is that which has been endorsed by people who've been inspired by Marx, not though by Marx himself, which is the necessity of technology itself, that it is technology that wants to. On as analogous to capital, technology also as an autonomous, something that will do its own thing. So this reflected in primarily, of course, in art and aesthetics. Thomas Pynchon, for instance, I remember right, wrote that the First World War was brought about not due to the pressures of imperialism and the European powers warring with each other, but technology was at this point where it had to burst past, and it needed war as this force multiplier for it to work. But I'm also wondering to connect it to Marx, because there is a point where he in relation to capital, he talks of a kind of accelerationist idea where it is the logic of capital itself that will eventually upset capitalism. Is there a logic you think of techno-capital where this kind of technology with its autonomous logic is going to undermine its own future and give us something else rather than us holding the reins back and something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Technology as such is helping techno-capitalism in the capitalist accumulation of an unexpected size. For example, a software system can be transacted at a price fixed by the buyer himself. That is, and that price seems to be astonishing to the seller. Just one example, Zuckerberg purchased WhatsApp by paying 19 billion US dollars. It's 8 or 9 people who wrote this software for WhatsApp. Never expected that this kind of a deal would happen. And they never bargained. Zuckerberg fixed the conditions. Zuckerberg said, I will give you cash 16 billion US dollars, and then the rest, that is $6 billion as the share in the company of Zuckerberg. So this is something unimaginable. Now, various patents and intellectual property rights are being transacted at this unimaginable level of pricing. And if that is the situation, then capitalism is not going to encounter in the near future any problem of depression. No recession is likely. After 2008, capitalism encountered no threat even during this period of health crisis and emergency. The reason is this, that it is accumulating capital at an unimaginable rate. So the intangible assets that they have accumulated is really very, very is very high size. Not only that, now they themselves openly declare that 4/5 of the total turnover all over the world in various sectors. If you compare the turnover various sectors, 4/5 is generated out of intangible assets or by way of intangible assets. That kind of a dimension of capitalism was never anticipated by Marx. You don't find any indication of that anywhere. Marx was certainly conscious about the depletion of natural resources, and then the seeds of capitalist economy that would destroy itself. He related to the natural resources, depletion of natural resources, and then the consequences. But he knew that there would be a situation if the kind of capitalism that he had experienced, certainly he was amazingly capable of anticipating various changes, but this kind of change he never expected. So that's what, that's the reason why we are not able to see the destruction of capitalism by itself. But there is one thing, and Marx was very insightful about the final phases of the development of capitalism, that capitalism would function on world level dictatorship. It would uproot democracy completely. And as Lenin made it simple by saying, the late phase of capitalism would be based on absolutism. So highest phase of capitalism would be imperialistic. And then Antonio Gramsci also said this, that there is a move towards a transnational imperialism. This is going to be true. Now, people would realize that capitalists do not have nations, they are transnationalists, and these corporates operate in the track of transnational imperialism. And then there would be a situation of 100% surveillance, the surveillance world, and no person will be maintaining anonymity. Every person will be a glass that can be looked through, transparent objects. Now, you do not know even now how many CC cameras you confront and where you have been recorded in what different ways, and how many times your eye metrics and biometrics have been recorded. Now, how machines are able to identify you, far more important than yourself. See, that kind of a situation is in existence. Now, what would be the fate of human beings in that kind of a situation? So naturally, there can be a major disruption. Or if Marx had thought about a total cosmopolitan kind of revolution, he thought about revolution taking place in big cities and then spreading. But now the whole world is going to be converted into a city at some stage, but city with the people mixed up with the robots and then all put under surveillance. And in that kind of a setup, human beings might restore their gregarious nature. They would come up as a big force, and then that could be the end of what is called techno-capitalism. Anyway, techno-capitalism, that is trading in marketable knowledge and transacting intellectual property and patents at unimaginable price, will not have what is called a capital crisis in the near future. Even if the pandemic is going to stay, if there are people capable of purchasing, many may die, but there would be people capable of sustaining themselves. And then with them, capitalism would survive.
Thanks for this point. And actually, this is actually a very interesting point. And on this note, if there are any no further questions, I think it's around 8 o'clock. And
Yeah, we can
thanks so much, Mr. Gurukul, for the very enlightening lecture and the question and answer session.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for everyone who's kind of stayed back to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Gurukul.
Okay, bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much, and,
Shall I leave the meeting?
again,
Okay, bye.
Thank you very much.
hope to see you on campus sometime in person, whenever. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.